Everyone knows lead poisoning brought down the Roman Empire. The story is tidy and satisfying. The Romans drank from lead pipes, sweetened their wine with lead, powdered their faces with it, and slowly went mad while their civilization rotted from the inside out. Then there is an inconvenient detail. Around the reign of the Emperor Augustus, a Roman architect named Vitruvius wrote down in plain language that lead was dangerous, that the men who worked it turned pale and sick, and that water should not be carried in lead pipes. He recommended clay instead. Rome read that warning and went on using lead for roughly another 500 years. So the neat version has a hole in it. If a mysterious metal was quietly poisoning Rome into collapse, why does a Roman engineer stand there, centuries before the fall, telling everyone to stop? The honest answer takes the tidy story apart and rebuilds it into something stranger and far more familiar. The Romans knew. They kept going anyway. We would do exactly the same thing with the same metal 1900 years later, and we would have our own Vitruvius shouting the same warning into the same indifferent room. The idea that lead felled Rome is not itself ancient. It is modern, and it has a traceable origin. In 1983, a geochemist named Jerome Nuriagu published a book arguing that chronic lead poisoning ran through the Roman ruling class and helped drag the empire down. It was a serious argument from a serious scientist, and it spread fast because it flattered the people repeating it. It let them feel clever about the past. Those poor Romans, undone by their own plumbing, too primitive to see the poison in the cup. I understand the appeal. I also went looking for the single excavation or study that actually proves it, the smoking cup, and I could not find one. What the evidence shows is real, and it is grim, and it is not that. Start with the pipes, since that is where the story usually starts. The Latin word for lead is plumbum. It is why the workers who fitted the pipes were called plumberi, and why the trade is still called plumbing today. Roman cities ran on lead. Water arrived through lead pipes stamped with the names of the men who cast them, and Frontinus, the official who ran Rome's water supply at the close of the 1st century, cataloged that whole system in careful detail. Hundreds of miles of aqueduct fed the capital, and where the water ran into the streets and the houses, it very often ran through lead. And Rome never set out to make lead in the first place. It set out to make silver. Silver ran the coinage and paid the armies, and the ore that silver came from, galena, is mostly lead. Smelt it for the silver, and you are left with lead by the ton. Cheap, abundant, a waste product looking for a use. Rome found uses. Pipes, cooking pots, coffins, cosmetics, weights, tokens, sling bullets, roof sheeting, and a sweet syrup for the wine. A whole civilization plumbed and seasoned with the leftovers of its silver habit. The scale is worth pausing on. By some readings of that frozen record in Greenland, the ancient world's output of airborne lead was not matched again until the Industrial Revolution, more than 1,000 years later. This was not a trace, it was an industry. The syrup is the part that did the real damage, and it had nothing to do with pipes. Romans loved a sweet reduction made by boiling grape juice down for hours, and the best pots for boiling it, they found, were lead. Cook grape must in a lead vessel, and the acid pulls lead straight out of the metal into the syrup as lead acetate, a compound that happens to taste sweet. Later ages gave it a blunt, fitting name. They called it sugar of lead. Sugar was scarce and costly in the ancient world. Here was sweetness anyone could boil up at home. Pliny the Elder recommended lead vessels for it. So did Columella in his handbook on running a farm. Neither man was hiding anything. They were writing down the ordinary recipe. The syrup, called sapa or defrutum, went into wine to sweeten and preserve it, into sauces, into medicine, into cheap food and expensive drink alike. When modern researchers reconstructed the recipe and boiled must in lead the old way, the syrup came out carrying enormous concentrations of lead, far beyond anything a body can safely take. By some estimates, a few spoonfuls a day of the sweetened wine would have been enough on their own to sicken a person slowly across a lifetime. Layer on the cosmetics and the lead-glazed cups, and a Roman table becomes a slow, sweet daily dose. The cosmetics deserve their own mention because they set lead directly on the skin of the people best able to afford it. A white powder made from lead, cerussa, was smoothed onto the face for the pale, even complexion the elite prized. It went on to exactly the faces that also drank the leaded wine and ate from the leaded tables. From there, it is tempting to run straight to the mad emperors, to explain every cruel or erratic Caesar as a lead casualty, and that claim is all over the internet. I would leave it alone. No one can reach into a dead emperor's biography and prove which choices a medal made for him. The exposure was real. The leap from exposure to any one man's madness is a guess dressed as a diagnosis. It helps to know what lead actually does inside a person, because the Romans felt the effects for centuries without ever seeing the cause. Lead enters the body wearing a disguise. It resembles calcium closely enough that the body waves it through, filing it into the bones as though it belonged there and letting it cross into the nervous system where calcium is meant to go. In the bones, it can sit for decades, leaking slowly back out. In the brain and nerves, it jams the signaling that thought and mood and self-control run on. Built up over years, the result is a dulling and a darkening, gut pain, weakness, tremor, memory that frays, and a temper that shortens. In children whose brains are still wiring themselves, even small amounts leave a permanent mark. None of it looks like poison while it happens. It looks like age or bad luck or a person simply turning difficult. We can measure it now, which the Romans could not. In 2014, a team led by the geochemist Hugo Delisle pulled sediment cores from the harbor of ancient Rome and found that Roman tap water had carried up to 100 times more lead than the spring water feeding it. The contamination reached far past the city too. Smelting silver throws lead into the air, and that airborne lead drifted for thousands of miles and settled onto the ice of Greenland, where it froze into the record and stayed. A 1994 study led by Sungmin Hong traced Greco-Roman lead sitting in Greenland ice, thousands of miles from any Roman mine. One of that study's authors was a man named Clair Patterson. Hold on to that name. He comes back. Picture the kitchen where the sweetness came from. A household on a warm afternoon, a wide lead pot over a low fire, grape must reducing hour after hour into a dark, thick syrup. Whoever stirred it, most likely an enslaved cook, tasted it as it thickened, watching for the moment it turned sweet. That sweetness was the poison. The better it tasted, the more lead had leached into the pot. No one in that kitchen saw anything wrong. The syrup was prized. It sold. It made rough wine taste like something finer than it was, and every jar of it carried a slow dose that built quietly in the bones and brains of everyone who ate from it, season after season, year after year. The kitchen is only half the story. The other half was sitting in Rome's own libraries, in warnings nobody acted on, because they were warned repeatedly by their own writers. Vitruvius did not merely prefer clay pipes on a whim. He wrote that the men who worked lead turned pale and sickly, and reasoned from their bodies to the water. Long before him, a Greek writer named Nicander had described the symptoms of lead poisoning, the gripping pain and the pallor, clearly enough that the illness is still recognizable in his lines. The physician Celsus noted its dangers as well. The knowledge existed. It was written down. It survived intact for 2,000 years, which is how it can still be quoted back today. So why keep using it? Because lead is almost perfectly built to be used. It melts at a low temperature, low enough to work over a simple fire, so it casts and bends and seals easily. It resists corrosion, so pipes made from it last. It came free, with the silver Rome already wanted, and its favorite compound tastes sweet in a world starving for sweetness. Every reason to use lead was concrete and immediate. Every reason to stop was slow, diffuse, and easy to argue away. That imbalance is the real engine of this story, and it did not stay buried in the ancient world. Which brings the story back to the collapse, and to being honest about it. Did lead poisoning actually bring down Rome? The careful answer is almost certainly not, and it is worth saying plainly, because this channel has hung the fall of an empire on one clever cause before, and got corrected for it. Here the specialists mostly stand on the skeptical side. The lead in those pipes was real, but Roman water ran constantly with no taps to shut it off, so it barely sat in the pipe long enough to pick up much lead. Hard water left a crust of mineral scale inside the pipes that walled the metal off from the flow. The archaeologist A. Trevor Hodge laid out exactly this case decades ago. Even Delisle's own team, the people who measured that 100-fold lead in the water, wrote that whether it truly harmed the city's health is unknown. And the timing is wrong. Rome's heaviest lead exposure ran for centuries, while the empire was expanding, not while it fell. I find the skeptics more convincing than the collapse theory for a simple reason. The mechanism that would kill a whole civilization was never really there. None of this means the lead was harmless. Individual Romans, especially the wealthy drinking the sweetened wine, almost certainly carried body burdens of lead that would alarm any modern doctor, and skeletons from the period bear it out. The point is narrower and more careful. Measurable harm to individuals is not the same thing as the fall of an empire, and only the first one is actually in the evidence. So set the collapse aside. What is left is quieter, and to me, far more unsettling. Not an empire killed by a metal it failed to understand, but a society that understood the metal well enough to write warnings about it and used it anyway at scale for centuries. Because it was useful. That is not a story about ancient people being stupid. It is a story about what usefulness does to a warning. Rome is where it starts. It is nowhere near where it ends. In 1921, an engineer at General Motors named Thomas Migley found that adding a lead compound, tetraethyl lead, to gasoline stopped car engines from knocking. It worked beautifully. There was one problem, and everyone close to it knew from the start. The additive was a potent poison, so they hid it in the name. The product went to market as ethyl, the word lead carefully left off the label, while the men manufacturing it were already falling ill. Then people began to die. In October 1924, at a tetraethyl lead plant in New Jersey, workers started hallucinating, convulsing, and losing their minds. 5 died within days. Dozens more were left with permanent neurological damage. The workers had a nickname for the buildings where the lead was handled. They called them the Looney Gas Buildings. Faced with the deaths, Migley called a press conference, poured tetraethyl lead over his bare hands, and breathed its fumes for the reporters to prove how harmless it was. He had already been poisoned by that same chemical himself, badly enough to take months away to recover. The first time I read that he did the hand-washing stunt on purpose, I assumed the account had to be exaggerated. It is not. He knew. He did it anyway. Not everyone played along. A Yale physiologist named Yandell Henderson warned that spreading lead across every road in the country was a slow-motion catastrophe. He estimated that some 30 tons of lead would settle onto a single Manhattan avenue every year. He was mostly ignored. By the 1960s, around 98% of American gasoline contained lead, and every car on the road was seeding it into the air, the soil, the dust, and the blood of children in every city on the planet. Reversing it took decades and a fight. The lead industry did not give way to the science. It spent years disputing the findings, funding its own experts, and casting the researchers who pushed back as alarmists. What finally broke the habit was partly an accident of engineering. The catalytic converters that cleaned up car exhaust in the 1970s were ruined by lead, so the fuel had to go unleaded whether the industry wanted it or not. Convenience, in the end, is what pulled the lead back out, the very same force that had put it in. The health case had been right for half a century. It was the machinery that finally settled the argument. One man would eventually measure just how thoroughly the modern world had coated itself, and he stumbled onto it by accident. Remember Clair Patterson from the Greenland ice? He was not trying to fight lead at all. He was trying to date the Earth using the slow decay of uranium into lead locked in ancient rock. And for that, he needed samples with no stray lead in them. He could not get any. Everything in his laboratory was contaminated. The air, the water, the dust, his own skin. Chasing the contamination to its source, he realized the entire modern world was wrapped in a thin, invisible film of industrial lead that had simply not existed a few centuries before. He built the first ultra-clean laboratories to escape it, and then spent the rest of his career forcing lead out of gasoline against an industry that attacked him for the trouble. Around the same time, a pediatrician named Herbert Needlemans showed that children carrying more lead in their bodies, even far below the level anyone then called poisoning, did measurably worse at school and on tests of attention. There was no safe dose. There never had been. Line the two stories up, and they are the same story in different clothes. A material almost too useful to refuse, a warning written down early, plainly, by someone credible, and a long run of years in which everyone who mattered could have known, and some plainly did, while the useful thing went on being used, because stopping cost money and the harm arrived slowly. Rome sweetened its wine with lead for the same reason the 20th century put lead in its fuel. It worked, it was cheap, and the damage never announced itself. The gap between knowing and stopping is where all the poison lives, and that gap is not a flaw of primitive minds. It is a flaw in how we weigh a sure benefit today against a vague cost tomorrow, and we are no better at that arithmetic than a Roman cook stirring a sweet pot. The modern world did, in the end, stop. Leaded gasoline is essentially gone now, phased out country by country over recent decades, with the very last national supplies running dry only a few years ago. Children's blood lead levels dropped sharply once it went, and that is a real victory, worth holding on to as proof these stories can end well. But lead does not leave on its own. It is still in the paint of old houses, the soil along old roads, the pipes beneath old cities. Millions of homes are still fed by lead service lines that nobody has yet dug up. When the water in Flint, Michigan turned discolored a decade ago, the cause was lead, leaching out of aging pipes into the tap. The Roman problem exactly in an American city in living memory. For decades, almost everyone alive carried lead in their blood at levels a doctor would flag today, much of it just from breathing city air. That was normal, and it stopped being normal astonishingly recently. Some researchers have even argued that the lead a whole generation breathed during the leaded gas decades left a mark on that generation's behavior, though the link there is a correlation still being argued over, not a settled fact. And I would rather flag it as unproven than sell it to you as certain. So the lesson the Romans leave behind is not really about pipes, and it is certainly not about the fall of an empire that lead never actually caused. It is about the shape of the mistake. Somewhere in an ordinary day, there's usually something cheap, convenient, and pleasant that a few careful people have already written a clear warning about in plain language where anyone could read it. The Romans had Vitruvius. The 20th century had Yandell Henderson and Clair Patterson. Finding the warning is almost never the hard part. The next time something turns out to be too useful to give up, the thing worth watching is not whether anyone warned us. It is whether we listen this time or spend another 5 centuries pretending we never heard.